Nihilism does not arrive in a single moment for Evil Morty. It grows quietly, like a thought someone tries to ignore until it becomes the only thought left. In the beginning, before he was the figure the multiverse learned to fear, he was simply another Morty. Another background face on an infinite canvas of versions. Another timid voice. Another frightened kid orbiting a Rick who believed the universe existed to be taken apart and rearranged at will. He started in the same place they all did, but something inside him refused to stay there. It was not rebellion at first, it was recognition. A soft, cold understanding that the universe around him was not built for his survival, and certainly not for his individuality. He felt this truth long before he ever acted on it. It sat in him like a quiet splinter. Most Mortys endure their lives by clinging to a story. They tell themselves that they matter because their Rick tells them they matter, or at least pretends to. They cope by believing the dangers around them have purpose. They convince themselves that being used as a shield is a form of importance. Evil Morty did not have that luxury. Every time he watched his Rick laugh at suffering, every time he saw another Morty sacrificed to protect someone smarter, every time he saw how little changed after so many deaths, something inside him sharpened. It was not anger yet. It was clarity. He saw the pattern that others could not bear to acknowledge. Mortys were disposable. Ricks ruled. The system was stable because everyone accepted their place. He was not built to accept it. At first he tried to ignore the creeping thought that nothing around him truly mattered. He tried to behave like the others, to lose himself in the noise, to hope the universe had some hidden layer of meaning waiting for him. But the more he looked, the more he found nothing. He saw false choices everywhere, illusions of control, hollow reassurances disguised as family bonds. Even the joys felt thin, like they had been copied too many times across too many dimensions. Everything was diluted. Everything felt second-hand. When something good happened, it never felt like a reward. It felt like an accident. That realization weighed heavily on him, meaning, as others understood it, required a world that cared, required a structure that rewarded truth, or at least growth. He looked around and saw a multiverse that rewarded only one thing: power, the ability to manipulate reality, the intelligence to bend systems in your favor. Everything else was ornament, decoration layered on top of a cruel foundation. The multiverse did not care about feelings or fairness or potential. It cared about who could break the rules without being broken in return. Evil Morty did not want to play that game, but he could not pretend the game did not exist. That contradiction became the birthplace of his nihilism. He was too perceptive to believe in a comforting lie, but too alive to surrender quietly. He lived in the tension between meaninglessness and survival, and that tension began to twist him into something new. He started noticing every small inconsistency in the stories people told themselves. Mortis insisted their suffering, bonded them to their Ricks, but he saw the truth. That bond was built on imbalance, fear, and habit. Ricks insisted they were free thinkers, pioneers of reason, rebels against cosmic authority, yet they built their own authority with cold precision. They believed they had escaped the tyranny of the universe, yet they recreated it through the Citadel. Evil Morty saw the irony clearly. Even the freest minds could not resist building cages, and those cages always trapped the weakest first. His nihilism did not begin as hatred. It began as disappointment, so vast it hollowed him from the inside. He wanted to believe in something. He wanted to find a reason to stay loyal, to stay hopeful, to stay soft. But everywhere he turned, existence contradicted the idea that anything mattered. Lives ended without consequence. Worlds disappeared. Families fell apart. Continuity itself bent and snapped whenever convenient. Evil Morty realized that the universe was not merely indifferent. It was unstable, self-erasing, and fundamentally incoherent. Most beings in the multiverse survived by ignoring this. Evil Morty survived by facing it. He started questioning everything he had been told. Why did Ricks need Mortys? Why did Mortys obey Ricks? Why did the Citadel exist? Why did no one revolt? Why did no one ask what the structure was built on? He found that every answer was circular. Ricks said Mortys were important because their presence masked the brainwaves of geniuses, and Mortys accepted this as purpose. Ricks said the Citadel was necessary because without order there would be chaos, and no one asked if the chaos might be preferable. Ricks said intelligence made them superior, but their own creations, mistakes, and rivalries proved the opposite. They were not gods. They were insecure inventors building fortresses out of fear. Evil Morty saw that fear clearly. He saw how fragile the hierarchy was. He saw how many Ricks needed the illusion of superiority to hold themselves together. He saw how many Mortys needed the illusion of belonging to survive one more day. Everything rested on belief, not truth. If the belief died, the structure would collapse. If the structure collapsed, the cycle would end. If the cycle ended, something new could begin. That thought became his first taste of genuine hope. It was small at first, a whisper buried under layers of contempt and exhaustion, but it was real. Even in a meaningless universe, one thing remained possible: change. Not moral change, or cosmic change, or emotional healing, but structural change. If nothing inherently mattered, then the rules did not matter either. If the rules did not matter, he could break them. If he could break them, he could build something different. He did not know what that new thing would be, but he knew it had to be better than the endless recycling of suffering he saw around him. Still, hope alone could not sustain him. Not yet. He had spent too long staring into the void of existence to believe that anything good would come easily. His nihilism was not passive. It was active, sharp, and self-shaping. It became a tool he used to carve through illusions. While other Mortys distracted themselves with fear or heroism, he studied the patterns that governed their lives. He observed how every Rick thought similarly, how every Morty reacted similarly, how predictability created control. He saw that the Citadel did not need enforcement when everyone had already internalized their place. That quiet obedience disturbed him more than open violence ever could. People who believed in the system were harder to free than those who feared it. He refused to be one of them. He began to let go of the emotional attachments that kept most Mortys compliant. He did not reject connection entirely. He rejected dependence. He rejected the idea that he needed a Rick to validate his existence. He rejected the belief that the universe owed him a purpose. He rejected the dream of being special in a multiverse where infinite versions of himself existed. His nihilism was not a collapse. It was a cleansing. Every belief he discarded made room for something sharper, colder, and more decisive. He found freedom in that emptiness. Without the weight of expectation, he could move without fear. Without the illusion of meaning, he could choose his own direction. Without the belief that anything mattered, he could focus on what could be controlled. His actions became intentional. His thoughts became disciplined. His perception widened. He saw weaknesses in the Citadel that no one else noticed, not because he was smarter, but because he was unbound. Mortys who wanted safety ignored the cracks. Mortys who wanted belonging ignored the contradictions. Mortys who wanted purpose ignored the cruelty. Evil Morty wanted none of those things, so he saw everything. He began to imagine himself outside the cycle completely. A Morty who did not serve, who did not submit, who did not need a Rick to define his narrative. That idea was radical in a universe built on repeating patterns. It was also terrifying. Possibility always is. But his nihilism gave him the strength to face that terror. If nothing mattered, then the cost of change did not matter either. If his existence was predetermined to be insignificant, then he had nothing to lose by aiming higher. His first step toward transformation was simple. He stopped accepting the role assigned to him. He stopped reacting like a frightened kid and started observing like a strategist. He listened to what Rick said, not because he respected them, but because he wanted to understand their blind spots. He watched how Mortys behaved, not because he felt connected to them, but because he needed to learn how their fear was maintained. Every smile, every insult, every moment of manipulation became data. Every escape, every crisis, every death became a lesson. He did not grow stronger through anger. He grew stronger through detachment. Yet even in this detachment, there was a small ember of feeling that he refused to extinguish. It was not compassion for the multiverse. It was not love for his counterparts. It was something quieter, more personal. A desire to reclaim his existence from the system that had stolen it. He did not care about justice or morality. He cared about autonomy. He cared about carving a path that did not require obedience or acceptance. He cared about proving that a Morty could break the pattern, even if the universe insisted that he could not. That desire fused with his nihilism, bending it away from despair and toward purpose. Not cosmic purpose, but chosen purpose. The purpose of dismantling the foundation that had dictated his entire life. The purpose of tearing apart a structure built on the suffering of those who looked like him. The purpose of proving that freedom was possible, even when the universe offered no inherent meaning. His transformation did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, through countless small realizations that chipped away at his former self. He stopped expecting kindness. He stopped waiting for fairness. He stopped believing that anything would improve on its own. Most importantly, he stopped believing that he was powerless. He accepted that the universe was cold and directionless, and in that acceptance, he found the strength to create his own direction. By the time he began taking concrete steps toward his destiny, his nihilism was no longer a burden. It was the lens through which he saw the truth. It was the shield that protected him from disillusionment. It was the fuel that allowed him to keep moving, even when the path ahead was dark. Nothing mattered inherently, but that meant he could decide what mattered personally. That paradox became the foundation of his identity. Evil Morty did not embrace nihilism because he wanted to watch the world burn. He embraced it because he wanted to escape the cycle that burned people like him every day. He saw meaninglessness not as an end point, but as a starting point. A blank page where something new could be written, even if that something disturbed the rest of the multiverse. In a reality where no one cared whether he lived or died, he chose to care about his own freedom. That choice made him dangerous. That choice made him unique. That choice shaped the path that would eventually lead him to challenge the entire multiverse itself. His story begins with nothingness, but it does not end there. It begins with the collapse of belief, but it grows into the construction of vision. Evil Morty did not choose nihilism because he was weak. He chose it because he refused to let the universe define what strength meant. In a world without inherent meaning, he became the author of his own. And in that self-made space, something like purpose flickered for the first time. Every Morty begins life inside a story, even if no one ever tells it to them. It is not written in books or carved into monuments. It is spoken in the way Ricks talk, in the way citizens look at a Morty, in the way the Citadel hums with quiet, suffocating certainty. The story says that Mortys are sidekicks, background noise, emotional stabilizers for a mind too sharp for comfort. It says they exist to be shaped by someone else, to learn through pain, to serve through fear, to believe through habit. The story is old. It has repeated itself so many times that it no longer needs to be enforced. It is simply lived. For Evil Morty, the moment he began to outgrow this story arrived long before anyone noticed. It did not look dramatic. It did not look revolutionary. It began in a quiet place, inside a quiet thought, during a moment when most Mortys would simply have cried and then moved on. He did neither. He observed. He saw the world around him not as a sequence of events, but as a structure built on assumptions. Once he understood those assumptions, he could step outside of them. The moment arrived during something small. Most transformations do. A Rick laughed at him. Not unusual, not surprising, not even cruel by typical standards. But it was the kind of laugh that comes from certainty, the kind that reveals how deeply someone believes in the story they inhabit. Rick laughed because he knew Mortys were predictable. The laugh expressed a worldview. Mortys react, Ricks lead. Mortys fear, Ricks innovate. Mortys cry, Ricks roll their eyes. It was a small gesture, but to Evil Morty it revealed everything. He saw the invisible script beneath the moment. He saw how every version of himself, across infinite timelines, was expected to behave. He realized that the universe did not only underestimate him, it required him to underestimate himself. That realization was like cold air filling his lungs. He understood suddenly that the story was not natural. It was cultivated, reinforced by culture, repeated by Ricks, believed by Mortys. And if it was cultivated, then it could be uprooted. If it was taught, then it could be unlearned. If it was a role, then it could be rejected. He did not react outwardly. He did not protest or argue. He simply folded the moment into himself and let it shape him. He began paying attention to every assumption people held around him. Every time someone spoke to him like he was fragile. Every time someone dismissed his opinion. Every time the universe responded to him as if he were replaceable. He catalogued these moments, not as insults, but as data. He was not offended. He was enlightened. The story of Mortys had always been a cage. But unlike most cages, this one was made of language, expectation, routine. People stayed inside it because they believed there was nothing outside. Evil Morty saw the bars clearly, and once he saw them, they could no longer hold him. His mind began to grow in directions the story did not permit. He started thinking thoughts that Mortys were not supposed to think. Not rebellious thoughts, but philosophical ones. He asked himself a question that no one had ever encouraged him to ask. Not what does the universe want from me? Not what does Rick want from me? But what do I become if I stop playing my part? Most lives never change because most people never ask that question. Evil Morty did. He began by examining fear. Fear was the mechanism that kept Mortys aligned with the narrative. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of disappointing Rick. Fear of death in some senseless adventure. Fear of being replaced by another Morty who could perform the role better. When he studied this fear, he noticed that its power rested on a simple belief. The belief that the story was inevitable. He tested that belief quietly. He ignored a command. Nothing happened. He questioned a decision. Nothing happened. He behaved unpredictably. Rick barely noticed. The story, he realized, was not self-correcting. It was fragile. It depended on Mortis behaving correctly. It depended on them staying inside the lines. He stepped 1 inch outside those lines, and the universe did not collapse. That was the first true crack in the narrative. Next came anger. Not explosive anger, not dramatic rage, but a slow, intelligent anger that formed when he realized the structure around him had never been designed for his growth. It had been designed for someone else's convenience. The anger did not push him toward revenge. It pushed him toward independence. He understood that as long as he remained within the story, he would remain dependent on the very system that constrained him. But he also realized something deeper, something that changed the shape of his destiny. The story did not only restrain Morty's, it restrained Rick's too. He began to notice vulnerabilities in the beings who claimed to be invincible. He saw how much of their identity depended on being the smartest in the room. He saw how desperately they clung to logic to avoid emotional truth. He saw how often they repeated the same patterns, the same feuds, the same cycles. Rick's claimed to be free thinkers, yet they lived inside a narrative even tighter than Morty's did. The story of the genius, the rebel, the untouchable being. Evil Morty realized that Rick's were trapped. Morty's were caged beneath them. Everyone was imprisoned by the same narrative, but at different heights. He refused to accept that limitation. He refused to be part of a hierarchy that had no ending. He refused to adopt a story that had already written his death. His mind expanded not through intelligence, but through awareness. He began to think in terms of systems. Who benefits from the Citadel? Who suffers? Who maintains the order? Who questions it? He recognized that meaninglessness had been disguised as stability. The Citadel was not a solution to chaos. It was a way to freeze chaos into routine. Evil Morty understood that order can be more destructive than disorder if it exists only to repeat itself. He saw through the myth of harmony. He saw through the myth of necessity. He saw through the myth that Mortis needed protection. He began to perceive the Citadel as a machine built to maintain the story, and like any machine, it could be dismantled. The moment he outgrew the story was not marked by a dramatic escape. It was marked by an internal shift, subtle but irreversible. He no longer measured himself through Rick's approval. He no longer feared the consequences of being different. He no longer felt bound to react like a frightened child. He saw his own life as a blank field, and he was free to draw whatever shape he wanted on it. From that point on, he stopped asking, "Why me?" He stopped searching for fairness. He stopped waiting for validation. He embraced the possibility that the universe would not give him meaning. He accepted that meaning was something he would have to build himself. That realization gave him a power greater than intelligence. It gave him autonomy. And autonomy was the one resource Mortis were never meant to have. That shift divided his life into two halves. The Morty he had been and the Morty he was becoming. The first half reacted to the universe. The second half questioned it. The first half accepted the role. The second half studied it. The first half waited to be saved. The second half began saving himself. He refused to be a passenger. He refused to be a prop. He refused to be one of infinite copies performing the same tired script. He started walking alone, not because he lacked companionship, but because he no longer wanted the kind that came from obligation. He allowed himself to think of a future that did not include the Citadel, a future that did not include the hierarchy. A future where Mortys were not defined by the proximity of a Rick. When he pictured that future, he felt something unexpected. Not hope, not excitement, but calm, freedom, he realized, begins as quiet before it becomes loud. It begins as a small clearing in the mind. It begins when the story loses its grip. Once he outgrew the story, his path became inevitable. He would challenge the structure, not because he hated Ricks or pitied Mortys, but because he refused to live inside something so hollow. If the universe offered no inherent value, then he would create a new system where value could be chosen. If the multiverse insisted on roles, he would tear them down. If the story was sacred, he would corrupt it until it broke. If infinite versions of himself lived in cages, he would be the one who climbed out and left the door open behind him. He did not outgrow the story by becoming extraordinary. He outgrew it by refusing to stay ordinary. And once he stepped beyond that boundary, there was no returning to who he had been. Once he tasted the unstructured world, he could never again believe in the old one. There comes a point in every life where continuing the same pattern becomes impossible. It does not matter whether someone is brave, frightened, intelligent, or unsure. Patterns eventually reveal their own hollowness. For Evil Morty, that point arrived long before he ever declared himself a threat to the structure around him. It arrived in the quiet space between obligation and awakening, in the painful recognition that repeating a cycle does not make it meaningful. Breaking away from the cycle was not rebellion for him, it was survival. His world had always been a loop. Morty follows Rick. Rick creates chaos. Morty suffers through it. Rick takes credit for surviving it. Morty suppresses his fear. Rick turns the moment into a joke. Morty resets the next day. Rick pretends nothing happened. It was all routine, tuned to perfection, repeated across dimensions. The tragedy of the cycle was that it pretended to be adventure. The comedy of the cycle was that the adventure pretended to have purpose. Most Mortys convinced themselves that being part of this loop was better than the alternative. They convinced themselves that accompanying a Rick gave them identity. Evil Morty saw the truth. The cycle erased identity. That was its function. The first break came not from anger, but from exhaustion. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet depletion that made it impossible for him to pretend any longer. Each time he lived the same loop, his mind grew heavier. He noticed how often risks were taken without thought. He noticed how often Mortys were positioned as tools. He noticed how often consequences fell on the same shoulders. He watched himself move through danger, like someone walking through rain they can never escape. Drops fell again and again, and he absorbed each one. Eventually, the weight of it made him stop, not physically, internally. A moment arrived when he no longer accepted the logic of the cycle. He observed Rick solving problems by creating bigger problems. He observed Rick blaming the universe for mistakes he made with his own hands. He observed Rick speaking as though he were the center of a cosmic joke, when in truth he was simply another participant in a pattern he was too proud to admit he followed. Evil Morty realized that Rick was not free. Rick was repeating himself. Rick was trapped. Once he saw that, the cycle around him lost its glamour. It became transparent, predictable, empty. Mortys were supposed to admire their Ricks. They were supposed to idealize them, to fear losing them, to value their intellect above all else. But idealization requires ignorance. It requires believing that the person above you has access to something you lack. Evil Morty recognized that the difference between him and Rick was not cosmic wisdom, it was access to power. Once power was removed from the equation, The cycle was just habit disguised as philosophy. Understanding this changed him. He noticed choices he had never seen before. He noticed he could stay silent instead of reacting. He noticed he could observe instead of answering. He noticed he could refuse to participate without the universe collapsing. The moment he realized that, the cycle began to crack. It became brittle, fragile. It no longer held the weight it once had. His first break from the cycle was not a grand betrayal. It was a shift in thinking, a step away from the script. When Rick barked a command, he did not jump to obey. When Rick laughed at him, he did not wince. When Rick dismissed him, he did not shrink. He simply allowed the moment to pass through him, untouched. This disturbed Rick in ways he could not articulate, because Ricks rely on certain reactions. They rely on Mortys looking frightened. They rely on Mortys asking for explanation. They rely on Mortys filling the emotional space that their own minds refuse to enter. Evil Morty removed himself from that emotional space entirely. He did not give Rick the comfort of his fear. He did not give Rick the illusion of authority. He did not give Rick the validation of being followed blindly. He allowed the cycle to weaken by refusing to feed it. A cycle cannot continue if one of its participants stops repeating their part. The rejection was subtle, but it changed the dynamic. Rick began speaking differently to him, less confident, more curious, less dismissive, more probing. Rick sensed a shift but could not name it, because nothing visible had changed. Evil Morty still stood near him, still followed him to different realities, still appeared to be the same Morty. But inside, the separation had begun. Rick was no longer the axis of his world. He was simply another character in a system he was studying. Breaking from the cycle required detachment, but it also required patience. Evil Morty knew that breaking away too quickly would draw attention. He had no desire for martyrdom. He understood that the system would fight back if he challenged it directly. The cycle survived because it fed on predictability. It remained stable because Mortis remained consistent. He chose to break the cycle through inconsistency, through quiet unpredictability, through the kind of subtle defiance that slips past notice. He began asking questions not out of curiosity, but out of strategy. Questions that probed the boundaries of Rick's logic. Questions that revealed the cracks in the hierarchy. Questions that made Rick uncomfortable, not because they were emotional, but because they were accurate. When he asked why Mortys needed Ricks, Rick deflected. When he asked why Ricks obeyed the Citadel despite claiming to hate authority, Rick avoided the subject. When he asked why their adventures always left them in the same emotional state, Rick joked rather than answering. Each non-answer was confirmation. The cycle existed precisely because no one asked these questions sincerely. Evil Morty understood that a system without truth can be weakened by exposing its contradictions. He collected these contradictions carefully. Not for revenge, not for chaos, for understanding. To break a cycle, one must understand every mechanism that keeps it turning. The first significant break came when he chose not to feel grief. A Morty died in front of him. Not him, but another version. The cycle expected him to mourn or panic or collapse. But he did none of those things. He stood in silence, assessing the moment. Not coldly, not cruelly, honestly. He recognized that grief had been weaponized against Mortis for generations. Grief was the emotional glue that kept them obedient. The cycle depended on Mortys, believing that each death meant something, that each loss held weight. But Evil Morty saw the truth. The multiverse replaced Mortys instantly. Death had lost meaning. Grief had become performative. He refused to participate in it. The moment he stepped away from grief, he stepped away from the emotional structure of the cycle entirely. Without grief, fear held less power. Without fear, obedience held less control. Without obedience, Rick became merely a man with a tool belt, not a cosmic guardian. Without that illusion, the cycle lost its core justification. He did not celebrate this shift, he simply accepted it. Acceptance was his liberation. Accepting that the cycle did not need to be followed allowed him to imagine a life outside it. Accepting that the universe did not care allowed him to stop caring about its rules. Accepting that Mortis were replaceable allowed him to stop worrying about being replaced. Acceptance stripped away everything that tied him to the old structure. After that, small acts of defiance became natural. He questioned decisions openly, not with hostility, but with a clarity Mortis were not supposed to possess. When Rick made a mistake, he pointed it out. When Rick miscalculated, he offered a correction before Rick could hide it. When Rick acted out of ego, he noted it quietly. Rick began to feel exposed. He began to behave differently, compensating for the shift without realizing it. Ricks do not like mirrors, especially ones held by those they consider inferior. Evil Morty did not break the cycle through confrontation. He broke it by refusing to play the emotional role it required of him. He became a Morty without fear, a Morty without devotion, a Morty without the conditioned reflexes that made the hierarchy stable. That alone was revolutionary. The cycle broke further when he admitted a truth to himself. He no longer cared about being loved. Love was another device that kept Mortis bound to their Ricks. Love created loyalty. Loyalty created vulnerability. Vulnerability created predictability. He refused to be predictable. He allowed himself to seek something deeper than affection, autonomy. That desire outweighed every emotional tether, every fear of abandonment, every need for validation. When he stopped wanting love from Rick, Rick lost his influence entirely. Once that happened, the cycle lost its hold. The loop flattened. The pattern blurred. Evil Morty stepped outside it, not through force, but through recognition. He saw the cycle for what it was. A script written by minds, afraid of chaos. A comfortable loop disguised as genius. A pattern that promised stability but offered stagnation. Escaping it required nothing external. It required only seeing it clearly. When he finally stepped out, he did not run. He did not hide. He simply moved with intention. He thought independently, acted independently, learned independently, and with each choice, the old pattern weakened until it could no longer pull him back. Breaking from the cycle did not make him free immediately, but it made freedom possible. Breaking from the cycle was the first step toward becoming someone who could challenge an entire multiverse. And he took that step alone, with steady breath, steady mind, and no need for permission. The multiverse is loud. It is filled with noise that disguises itself as meaning. Ricks argue with themselves. Mortys scream in fear. Planets crumble, rebuild, and collapse again. Every corner of existence hums with contradiction. Most people drift through that chaos, reacting to whatever happens next. They do not choose their direction. They simply follow the strongest current. Evil Morty refused to drift. The moment he broke from the cycle, he discovered an emptiness inside him that the old world had kept hidden. It was not loneliness. It was not despair. It was space. Room to choose. Room to define. Room to think without being shaped by the expectations of a Rick or the limitations of a Morty. He had separated himself from the narrative, but separation alone was not enough. He needed direction. At first, he did not know what direction looked like. Most Mortys never learn to select their path. They wait for instruction. They wait for guidance. They wait for a Rick to declare purpose. Evil Morty had no interest in waiting. But removing the old structure did not immediately reveal a new one. He had cleared the ground, but the landscape was unknown. He found himself in a place that Mortis were not supposed to inhabit. A place without rails, without safety nets, without scripts. He had to build his own compass, and for a long while the compass did not point anywhere. The silence of freedom unsettles most people. It reminds them how little of their life was chosen. For Evil Morty, the silence became a challenge. If nothing guided him, he would guide himself. If nothing protected him, he would calculate protection. If nothing gave him purpose, he would build one from pieces of truth the universe ignored. His first step toward direction began with observation. Not emotional observation, but structural observation. He studied the Citadel more carefully than any Morty had before. He walked its corridors unnoticed, watched how decisions were made, how power was distributed, how control was maintained. His mind became a lens, capturing everything without judgment. He kept his presence small, his reactions still, his thoughts hidden behind the mask of a Morty who seemed compliant. The Citadel fascinated him, not because it was impressive, but because it was weak. Everyone believed it was stable. Everyone believed it was inevitable. But the closer he looked, the more he saw that it was built on fear, not strength. It relied on Ricks believing they were superior. It relied on Mortys believing they were inferior. It relied on repetition, not wisdom. Every system pretends to be invincible until someone studies it without reverence. Evil Morty studied the Citadel and found it riddled with contradiction. The first contradiction was the illusion of unity. Ricks claimed they gathered to escape oppression, to build a society where genius could thrive. But they did not build unity. They built a hierarchy disguised as community. Their alliances were unstable. Their ideologies fractured. Their egos collided constantly. A system cannot sustain unity when everyone inside it believes they are the smartest person in the room. That contradiction became the first brick in Evil Morty's direction. He realized that the Citadel could be dismantled from within, not through violence, but through the natural instability of the minds that built it. The second contradiction was the reliance on Mortis. The Citadel depended on Mortis to function smoothly. Mortis were the workers, the caretakers, the emotional buffers, the quiet population that allowed the system to operate. Yet those same Mortys were treated as expendable. The structure required emotional suppression from them. But suppressed populations do not stay quiet forever. That truth became the second brick. Evil Morty realized that the Citadel's foundation was not solid. It was brittle, fragile, stretched thin across too many assumptions. The third contradiction was the belief that the Citadel was necessary. Ricks preached that without it, chaos would consume their species. But Evil Morty saw that chaos had already consumed them. Their innovations harmed more than they helped. Their politics were unstable, their relationships were shallow, their morality was inconsistent. They feared collapse, but they were already collapsing. The Citadel was not a solution to chaos. It was a monument to fear, pretending to be order. These contradictions gave him something he had lacked until now, a direction. Not a fully formed one, but a trajectory. He realized that breaking the Citadel was not simply possible, it was inevitable. If he did nothing, time would eventually shatter it. But he was not content to wait. He saw something the multiverse refused to see. The Citadel was a prison disguised as a sanctuary. It trapped both Rick's and Morty's. Removing it would not increase danger. It would reveal truth. With direction forming, he began practicing a new kind of thinking. Thinking that was not reactive, not emotional, not conditioned. Thinking built on long horizons, not immediate survival. He learned to anticipate not one outcome, but dozens. He learned to study people as systems. Rick's became predictable. Mortis became predictable. Politics became predictable. When he saw a rule, he searched for its exception. When he saw a pattern, he searched for its blind spot. When he saw a weakness, he studied how deeply it ran. His mind stopped functioning like that of a frightened companion. It began to function like that of a strategist. But strategy alone cannot sustain direction. Direction requires motive. Not emotional motive, but structural motive. Evil Morty had one. He remembered every Morty he saw discarded. He remembered every Morty who died unnoticed. He remembered every Morty who believed their suffering mattered, unaware that the multiverse replaced them instantly. He did not act out of pity. He acted out of clarity. If a system expects people to sacrifice themselves endlessly, then the system must be confronted. His direction sharpened further when he realized something most beings never articulate. A system can endure injustice. A system cannot endure scrutiny. Once someone sees clearly how it works, they can no longer pretend it is natural. That understanding fueled him. He did not need to destroy the Citadel immediately. He merely needed to understand it completely. The more he understood, the more fragile it seemed. He spent long nights studying architecture, command structures, communication systems, databases, political frameworks. He moved like a ghost. No one noticed his presence. Rick's believed Mortys were incapable of strategic thinking. Mortys believed Mortys were incapable of strategic thinking. That ignorance became his protection. He hid in plain sight, gathering everything he needed. Direction soon evolved into intention. He began to imagine a future without the Citadel, a future without the hierarchy. Not a utopia, not a paradise, but a future where people were no longer forced into roles written before they were born. He wanted a world where Mortys could exist without depending on someone else's genius. A world without labels, categories, destinies. A world where self-direction was not impossible. That vision was not sentimental, it was practical. Systems built on imposed identity always collapse eventually. Evil Morty simply chose to accelerate the process. That intention marked a turning point. He stopped drifting. He stopped observing passively. He began acting. Not openly, quietly, intelligently, patiently. He planted questions into conversations. Questions that caused doubt. Doubt weakened conviction. Conviction weakened control. He spread uncertainty through the minds of those who had never questioned the structure. He did not need to push anyone. He only needed to open a doorway. Once opened, minds would walk through on their own. He began forming small alliances, not friendships. Alliances built on shared dissatisfaction. Mortys who felt trapped. Ricks who felt overlooked. Citizens who felt the system had lost its way. He studied how humans overthrow governments, how ecosystems collapse, how biological systems fail when stressed repeatedly. Every discipline offered insight. Every insight added strength to his direction. He tested ideas quietly, checking how the system responded. He learned where resistance was strong and where it was weak. He learned which individuals could be influenced and which would remain loyal to the old order. He learned how narratives spread and how fear could be shaped. The Citadel believed it controlled its population. Evil Morty recognized that narrative was the real source of control. Whoever shaped the narrative shaped the future. His direction finally solidified into a philosophy, a worldview. Not nihilism in its original form, but something more refined. He accepted meaninglessness as the default state of existence, but he used that acceptance to construct purpose. If nothing mattered, then structures claiming authority were illusions. If structures were illusions, then anyone who saw through them could alter reality. He aligned himself with that truth until it stopped being theory and became identity. Self-direction did not make him arrogant. It made him distant. He no longer sought approval. He no longer needed reassurance. He no longer feared being wrong. He embraced the idea that progress came from discomfort, not validation. This distance allowed him to design larger plans, plans that Mortys were never meant to imagine. Direction sharpened into ambition, not ambition for power, but ambition for liberation. Liberation through dismantling, liberation through restructuring, liberation through truth. He did not romanticize revolution. He understood its cost, but he also understood that living within the old structure cost far more. By the time he was ready to take his first strategic actions, he had already become something the system could not categorize. He was not a rebel, not a leader, not a villain, not a victim. He had evolved beyond the labels that once confined him. He had built a self that existed outside the cycle, outside the story, outside the expectations of the multiverse. The birth of self-direction did not happen in a single spark. It happened through accumulated clarity. Each realization carved away illusions. Each illusion removed revealed truth. Truth created vision. Vision created direction. And direction created the possibility of change. At this stage, Evil Morty was not yet the force the Citadel would come to fear. He was something far more dangerous. He was a Morty who no longer needed a Rick to survive. And in the multiverse, that was the rarest and most unstable kind of being. There are many ways a person can grow. Most people grow reactively, shaped by circumstance, pushed by hardship, softened by connection. Their minds evolve because the world forces them to change. But some individuals evolve in silence, through deliberate thought, through careful refinement, through the slow accumulation of truth. Evil Morty belonged to the second category. His evolution was not emotional, it was philosophical. It happened in the quiet cracks between events, during moments when no one was watching. His world never offered him the luxury of soft growth, so he crafted a different kind. A mind shaped not by comfort or fear, but by clarity. Once he began directing himself, he discovered that his mind had capacity far beyond what he had been taught to expect. Mortys were conditioned to believe they were limited, conditioned to believe their thinking should orbit someone else's, conditioned to believe their insights were accidental. Evil Morty rejected that conditioning. He treated his mind as a tool to be sharpened. He studied not for approval, but for survival. He learned not to mimic brilliance, but to understand its structure. His evolution began with discipline. Not the rigid discipline of routines or strict behavior, but the quiet discipline of attention. He trained himself to observe without emotion, to listen without reacting. to collect information without revealing interest. Most minds cannot hold information neutrally. They distort it through desire or fear. Evil Morty stripped those distortions away. When he observed a Rick, he did not feel intimidated. When he observed a Morty, he did not feel pity. When he observed a system, he did not feel overwhelmed. He simply absorbed, analyzed, and stored. This discipline allowed him to notice patterns others missed. For instance, he realized that Ricks rarely questioned their assumptions. Their intelligence made them careless. Their certainty made them predictable. Their egos made them blind to small details. His evolving mind used those details. He noticed gestures, tones, patterns of movement. He noticed how a Rick navigated authority, how he lied, how he avoided emotional truths. Each observation became a piece of data that sharpened the lens through which Evil Morty viewed the world. He applied the same attention to Mortys, not out of kinship, but out of study. He noticed how quickly they apologized, how often they deferred, how easily they accepted blame. He noticed their fear responses, their hesitation patterns, their instinct to look for permission before speaking. These conditioned behaviors fascinated him. They revealed how deeply the hierarchy was embedded. Mortys did not mimic fear, they internalized it. Their fear was their script, and scripts are the easiest things to erase once you understand the language they are written in. His mind grew sharper each time he examined the contradictions within the people around him. He learned how fear shapes logic, how authority shapes perception, how insecurity shapes cruelty. These insights made him less vulnerable to manipulation. Ricks could not control him emotionally because he no longer accepted their emotional framework. Mortys could not restrict his thinking because he no longer saw their limitations as relevant. He studied minds the way one studies machinery. He broke them down into gears and levers. He watched how each part interacted. He saw how one missing piece could collapse the whole. But his evolution went deeper than psychological insight. He began studying ideas, big ideas. Ideas that most Mortys never encountered and most Ricks never contemplated sincerely. He studied the nature of identity, the structure of choice, the illusion of free will, the mathematics of systems, the philosophy of meaning, the destruction of meaning, the mechanics of power, the ethics of rebellion, the consequences of liberation. He did not study to feel enlightened. He studied to build a foundation for his worldview. He understood that philosophy without application was decoration, and he had no interest in decoration. He often read quietly while others slept. He reviewed data while others relaxed. He designed theoretical models while others processed trauma. His evolution was sustained by this relentless internal work. Every idea he encountered either strengthened his direction or refined it. If an idea contradicted his worldview, he examined the contradiction until he understood its source. He did not reject unfamiliar thoughts. He dissected them. He asked whether they revealed a blind spot in his own thinking. If they did, he corrected it. If they did not, he stored the idea for later use. Through this process, he developed a rare kind of flexibility, the ability to shift perspective without losing identity. Most beings cling to their worldview for comfort. Evil Morty used his worldview as a tool, not a shield. When he saw something that challenged it, he adjusted. When he encountered something that confirmed it, he strengthened it. His mind grew not in one direction, but in many. It became like a network. Each insight connected to another. Each connection generated new possibilities. One of the most significant insights he developed was understanding how people justify cruelty. He noticed that Ricks framed cruelty as logic. Mortys framed cruelty as inevitability. The Citadel framed cruelty as efficiency. In each case, cruelty was not admitted, it was disguised. His evolving mind recognized that cruelty only thrives when people deny it. So he made a decision. He would never deny the cruelty within his own philosophy, not to embrace it, but to understand it. If liberation required harm, he would acknowledge that harm fully. He would not pretend it was righteous. He would not hide behind noble rhetoric. He would accept it as consequence. This honesty made him stronger. It gave him clarity that others lacked. Vision without self-honesty is fragile. His vision became unbreakable because he understood every cost embedded within it. He also learned to regulate his emotions strategically. He did not suppress them. He refined how they influenced him. Fear became data. Sadness became perspective. Anger became energy. His emotions no longer dictated his choices. They informed them. This emotional equilibrium allowed him to make decisions coldly when needed and empathetically when beneficial. It allowed him to read situations without bias. It allowed him to predict reactions without projecting his own feelings onto others. This balance made him unpredictable. People expected Mortys to break down emotionally. People expected them to panic or resist or surrender. Evil Morty did none of those things. His calm made others uneasy. Even Ricks sensed it. Calm minds disturb chaotic ones. Calm Mortys disturb arrogant ones. His calm became a silent weapon. As his mind evolved, so did his confidence. Not outward confidence, not bravado, but internal certainty. He knew his thoughts were his own. He knew his direction was self-chosen. He knew his observations were accurate. Confidence born from clarity is the most stable kind. It does not need validation. It does not crumble under pressure. His plans began to take shape because he believed in their foundation, not because he believed in his own greatness. His evolution made him capable of holding contradictions without losing his identity. He could believe in freedom while using manipulation to achieve it. He could accept meaninglessness while constructing purpose. He could care about liberation while refusing to sentimentalize suffering. Most minds need simplicity. His did not. Complexity became his form of understanding. Ambiguity became his source of power. He also developed the ability to think long-term. Mortys think in moments. Ricks think in projects. The Citadel thinks in cycles. Evil Morty learned to think in eras. He questioned what the multiverse would look like 50 years after the Citadel fell. He questioned what identity would mean when the old roles dissolved. He questioned how people would rebuild meaning after liberation. This long vision gave him a strategic advantage. Most revolutionaries focus only on the moment of overthrow. Evil Morty focused on what came after. That foresight made his philosophy sustainable. As his mind sharpened, he also developed the ability to detach from his own pain without ignoring it. He analyzed his trauma the way one analyzes a storm. What caused it? What sustained it? What shaped it? What patterns it created? He refused to let pain define him, but he refused to pretend it had no effect. This balance allowed him to use his past without being controlled by it. One of the most profound shifts in his evolution was understanding that self-creation is a continuous process. He did not seek a final identity. He allowed himself to change. He allowed his thoughts to evolve. He allowed his future to reshape him. Identity became fluid. Purpose became adaptive. Direction became dynamic. This adaptability made him resilient. Systems break, when they cannot adapt. People break for the same reason. Evil Morty evolved because he embraced change instead of fearing it. Through all this intellectual evolution, he held one central truth at his core. If the universe offered no inherent meaning, then the only meaning worth having was the meaning one created deliberately, meaning built through truth, not illusion, through clarity, not hope, through autonomy, not obedience. By the time his mind finished its quiet transformation, he no longer felt like a Morty at all, not because he rejected his origins, not because he despised his identity, but because he had grown beyond the limitations assigned to him. He had become something the multiverse had not prepared for. A being with a Morty's appearance and a philosopher's mind. A strategist without a Rick. A thinker without a cage. His mind was no longer a reaction to the world. It was a force that could reshape it, and it had only just begun to sharpen. Nihilism is often misunderstood. People imagine it as darkness, as despair, as the collapse of every reason to continue living. They imagine it as a dead end, a void, a place where nothing can grow. But Evil Morty did not experience nihilism in that way. To him, it was not collapse. It was liberation. It was the removal of false meaning, not the removal of meaning itself. It was the clearing of a field, not the destruction of it. When he embraced nihilism, he did not shrink into himself. He expanded. His mind began to move differently, think differently, build differently. Nihilism became not a pit, but a foundation. His philosophy grew from that foundation, layer by layer, each idea challenging the one before it, each truth tested until it became stable enough to guide him. His philosophy did not begin with anger. It began with clarity. He realized early on that the universe operated without intention, not because it was cruel, but because it was indifferent. Worlds appeared and ended without reason. People lived and died without pattern. Continuity broke whenever convenient. Time loops contradicted themselves. Logic failed in places where chaos reigned. The very fabric of existence seemed held together by habit rather than purpose. Most beings found this terrifying. They clung to stories. They clung to routines. They clung to hierarchy because hierarchy made the universe feel ordered. Evil Morty had no desire for comforting illusions. When he looked at the multiverse, he saw truth where others saw chaos. He saw possibility where others saw collapse. If nothing was fixed, then everything was flexible. If nothing was designed, then everything could be redesigned. Meaninglessness was not a cage. It was the removal of boundaries. When he understood that, his philosophy found its first principle. Nothing limits you except the meanings you refuse to abandon. That principle shaped the rest of his worldview. He examined every belief he had inherited. The idea that Mortys must be afraid. The idea that Ricks must be leaders. The idea that intelligence must create loneliness. The idea that chaos must be endured. Each belief failed when tested. When he removed them, he found space. Space for new thoughts, space for a new self, space for possibility. His second principle emerged from studying the Citadel. The Citadel believed it represented order, but order created by fear is not order. It is stagnation. Ricks had built a structure that repeated their insecurities endlessly. They believed it gave them control over their destiny. In reality, it trapped them in a self-reinforcing loop. Evil Morty realized that most systems claiming to preserve freedom exist only to preserve themselves. His second principle took form. Any system that demands obedience is already broken. This principle shaped the way he viewed authority. He did not despise authority. He simply recognized that authority which relies on fear cannot be justified. He saw how often the Citadel hid behind efficiency while ignoring the suffering it caused. He saw how Rick's justified cruelty because cruelty made things easier for them. He saw how Morty's tolerated this because the system had convinced them that obedience was the only path to survival. The entire hierarchy existed not because it worked, but because it kept itself alive. His philosophy made rejecting that structure inevitable. His third principle grew from observing emotion. Most people treat emotion as truth. They believe that fear reveals danger, anger reveals injustice, grief reveals meaning. Evil Morty realized something different. Emotion reveals attachment, and attachment reveals vulnerability. He did not suppress his emotions, he understood them. He traced each one back to its origin. Fear came from the story he had begun rejecting. Anger came from seeing truth others ignored. Sadness came from recognizing how much potential was wasted in the multiverse. But none of these emotions defined him. He used them the way one uses a compass. They pointed toward deeper truths, but they did not dictate his path. From this, his third principle emerged. Emotion is information, not command. This principle protected him. It allowed him to experience feelings without bowing to them. It allowed him to understand others without losing himself in their chaos. It allowed him to critique the systems around him without bitterness. A calm mind is difficult to manipulate. His calm made him unswayed by emotional traps. It made him capable of seeing clearly during moments when others collapsed. His fourth principle arose from studying identity. He saw how identities were assigned by the structure, not chosen by the individual. Mortys were expected to be anxious, loyal, and replaceable. Ricks were expected to be brilliant, arrogant, and emotionally distant. The Citadel kept these identities intact because identity made people predictable. Evil Morty refused predictability. He recognized that identity must be built, not inherited. That insight crystallized into his fourth principle. Identity that is assigned is a cage. Identity that is built is a weapon. He chose to build his own identity deliberately, piece by piece. He did not accept labels. He did not step into roles. He did not seek validation. Each part of himself was chosen, tested, refined. He did not grow into who he became naturally. He constructed himself like a structure designed to withstand pressure. The fifth principle emerged slowly. It came from observing suffering, not emotional suffering, but structural suffering. Suffering caused by systems, suffering caused by hierarchy, suffering caused by cycles that repeated endlessly. He saw that suffering often persisted because people refused to acknowledge its causes. They blamed fate, they blamed bad luck, they blamed individuals. They rarely blamed the system itself. Evil Morty saw that as long as people pretended systems were natural, suffering would remain, invisible. From this, he formed the fifth principle. Never accept suffering that exists only to preserve a system. This principle shaped his approach to dismantling the Citadel. He did not want to erase individuals. He wanted to erase the structure that required individuals to suffer in order to function. He knew that dismantling systems creates chaos. But he also understood that the absence of structure is not worse than the presence of an oppressive one. Chaos allows new structures to grow. Oppression allows only the old one to survive. The sixth principle emerged from observing freedom. Most beings believed freedom was the absence of rules. But Evil Morty realized that the absence of rules does not create freedom. it creates disorientation. Ricks believed they were free because they rejected authority, but their rejection was predictable. They rejected authority to maintain the illusion of control. They refused to accept vulnerability. They refused to challenge their own assumptions. That was not freedom. That was denial. Evil Morty's sixth principle was different. Freedom is not escape. Freedom is awareness. Awareness of self. Awareness of limitation. Awareness of possibility. Awareness of meaninglessness. This awareness gave him choices others could not see. It allowed him to choose direction in a universe shaped by chaos. Freedom did not mean doing whatever he wanted. It meant understanding why he wanted it and what it would cost. His seventh principle formed from studying destruction. The Citadel taught him that destruction could stabilize a system temporarily. People destroy threats. They eliminate dissent. They erase difference. But destruction can only delay collapse, not prevent it. Evil Morty recognized something deeper. Creation requires destruction, but destruction must have intention. His seventh principle became this: destruction without purpose is brutality. Destruction with purpose is transformation. This principle gave structure to his plans. He did not want to burn the Citadel out of hatred. He wanted to open space for something better. He wanted to break the cycle so that new cycles could form. He accepted that his vision required harm, but he refused to let harm become the point. He used destruction as a tool, not a philosophy. The eighth principle emerged from watching people cling to comfort. Comfort makes people easy to control. It makes them passive. It makes them fearful of change. Evil Morty understood that comfort can be more dangerous than suffering because comfort hides cracks. When people are comfortable, they stop questioning. They stop evolving. Systems use comfort to keep people quiet. His eighth principle became this: comfort dulls the mind. Only discomfort reveals truth. He did not seek constant pain. He sought awareness. Awareness that comes from stepping outside familiar patterns. Awareness that comes from refusing easy answers. Awareness that comes from confronting the structure directly instead of living around it. This principle allowed him to remain alert. It kept his mind from stagnating. It prevented him from falling into the same arrogance that trapped Ricks. The ninth principle came from recognizing that purpose is not found, it is made. People search endlessly for meaning. They wait for signs. They wait for validation. They wait for epiphany. Evil Morty realized that meaning becomes real only when someone accepts responsibility for shaping it. His ninth principle became this: purpose must be created, not discovered. This principle became the heart of his philosophy. It guided his actions calmly, steadily, without guilt or hesitation. He did not wait for someone to tell him what the universe wanted. The universe wanted nothing. That truth freed him. Purpose became a craft, not a revelation. He built it the same way he built his identity: thoughtfully, carefully, intentionally. His 10th principle might be the most important. It formed from observing how the multiverse maintained itself. Systems continue not because they are strong, but because no one imagines alternatives. Evil Morty realized that imagination is more powerful than any hierarchy. His 10th principle was this: the imagination of one free mind can destabilize an entire system. That principle shaped his approach to change. He did not lead through speeches. He did not inspire through charisma. He destabilized through imagination, through seeing what others refused to see, through thinking what others avoided thinking, through imagining a world without the Citadel, long before anyone believed it could fall. By the time all 10 principles settled into place, his philosophy had become stable enough to guide an entire revolution. It was not the philosophy of a hero. It was not the philosophy of a tyrant. It was the philosophy of someone who understood that meaninglessness is not a threat but a blank canvas. It freed him, and soon it would free many others. Revolutions rarely begin with shouting. They begin in silence, in the quiet places where someone finally admits a truth they can no longer ignore. For Evil Morty, the decision to challenge the Citadel did not come from rage or hope or desperation. It came from clarity. He saw the structure for what it was, and once the illusion dissolved, the decision became inevitable. A broken system does not reform itself. A parasitic hierarchy does not volunteer to step aside. A cycle that survives through habit will continue until someone interrupts it deliberately. Evil Morty became that interruption. He did not make the decision in a single moment. It accumulated slowly, forming in layers as he watched the Citadel repeat itself. He noticed how each Rick believed the Citadel reflected genius, yet it required conformity to survive. He noticed how each Morty believed they were safer within its walls, yet their safety was merely statistical. Mortys disappeared, suffered, or died constantly, but the Citadel disguised this loss by replacing them instantly. Loss never registered because the system had no interest in remembering individuals. That realization disturbed him deeply, not emotionally, but logically. A system that cannot remember its people cannot value them. A system that cannot value its people cannot justify its existence. From this truth emerged the first seed of revolt. He questioned whether a structure that functioned through erasure deserved to continue functioning at all. But clarity alone does not lead to revolt. Evil Morty needed motive. A deeper motive than anger at injustice. Because justice had no meaning in a universe without inherent morality. He needed a reason grounded in his philosophy, not in sentiment. That reason emerged when he traced the cost of the Citadel's existence across timelines. He noticed how often Mortis were funneled into narrow futures, how their identities were shaped by fear, how their lives were cut short by decisions made without their consent. The Citadel did not simply limit Mortis, it defined them. It assigned them a purpose before they could think for themselves. He studied how effectively the system crushed autonomy. He saw how easily Mortis accepted their place, how quickly they learned that rebellion was futile, how deeply they internalized the belief that their life was secondary. It was not enough for the system to control their bodies, it controlled their minds. Without free thought, no Morty could truly escape. That was when the decision formed more clearly. He realized that the Citadel's greatest harm was not physical suffering. It was philosophical suffocation. It prevented self-direction. It prevented introspection. It prevented choice. A universe without freedom of mind was not worth preserving. A universe that functioned only because people were prevented from thinking could not be allowed to continue indefinitely. But even this did not fully motivate him. He was not driven purely by compassion for the Mortys trapped inside the structure. His motive came from something broader. He saw that the Citadel damaged the entire multiverse. It prevented evolution. It paralyzed innovation. It encouraged stagnation. Ricks believed the Citadel elevated them, but in truth, it limited them. It created intellectual echo chambers. It prevented genuine progress. Evil Morty understood that a system built on hierarchy cannot produce true advancement. It can only produce repetition. His decision crystallized when he realized the Citadel would never collapse on its own. It had lasted too long. It had become too normalized. Even dissatisfied, Rix refused to imagine a world without it. The structure was too embedded in too many minds. Left alone, it would continue indefinitely, producing the same suffering, the same stagnation, the same fear. He saw that the Citadel was incapable of transformation. A structure that cannot transform must be destroyed. But he also understood the weight of such an action. He respected the scale of it. He understood that dismantling a central structure would unleash chaos throughout the multiverse. And chaos, though fertile, would harm many innocent beings. He allowed himself to feel that weight. He did not dismiss it. He examined it carefully. He analyzed whether the cost outweighed the benefit. He did not let emotion cloud his conclusion. He considered the long-term consequences, how identity might evolve once the hierarchy dissolved, how Mortys might adapt, how Rix might react, how systems might rebuild in unpredictable ways. After long consideration, he reached his conclusion. The cost of letting the Citadel persist was greater than the cost of destroying it. The system did not deserve mercy, because it had never spared anyone beneath it. The multiverse deserved a chance to evolve naturally, without the influence of a structure built on the insecurity of genius. It deserved a chance to breathe. Another part of his breathe-ale decision formed from something more personal, not emotional, but existential. He understood that as long as the Citadel existed, his autonomy would never be complete. His identity would always be interpreted through the lens of the system he rejected. He would always be a Morty who disobeyed, not a being who chose his own direction. The Citadel defined him even in rebellion. True freedom required removing the structure entirely, not simply resisting it. He did not want to be a deviation. He wanted to exist in a world where deviation no longer had meaning. His decision to challenge the Citadel strengthened further when he realized how deeply the hierarchy had infected the thinking of everyone inside it. Even those who hated the structure could not imagine life without it. Rix, who disagreed with its politics, still benefited from its privileges. Mortys, who hated their position, still depended on it for survival. He saw that the Citadel remained stable not because it was functional, but because it had replaced imagination with fear, and any structure that prevents people from imagining alternatives deserves to fall. He recognized that the Citadel represented the worst possible interpretation of nihilism, a structure built on meaninglessness, but maintained through cruelty. Rix believed the universe had no inherent purpose, yet they used that belief to justify exploitation. They used it to excuse violence. They used it to shield themselves from the consequences of their actions. The Citadel had twisted nihilism into an excuse for stagnation. Evil Morty refused to accept that version of the philosophy. If meaninglessness is the foundation of existence, then it can inspire creation just as easily as destruction. It can free people instead of trapping them. It can allow new truths to emerge instead of reinforcing outdated ones. His version of nihilism demanded transformation, not apathy. He made the decision to challenge the Citadel because he refused to let the worst interpretation of the universe become the default one. This decision did not make him reckless. He approached it with caution, strategy, and respect for the magnitude of what he intended to do. He understood that any plan large enough to dismantle a central authority had to be executed with precision. He needed secrecy. He needed influence. He needed a way to disrupt the structure from within. And he needed to be patient. Systems built on fear collapse slowly until they collapse suddenly. He embraced the slow part. He prepared for the sudden part. As the decision settled into him, he felt a strange calm. Not excitement, not dread, calm, a sense of direction so clear that it silenced the noise of the multiverse. He did not need to force himself forward. The path unfolded naturally. Every insight he had gathered, every contradiction he had noticed, every truth he had accepted pointed in the same direction. His decision simply aligned his actions with what he already knew. The Citadel could not survive clarity, and he had become the clearest mind inside it. He walked among Ricks and Mortys unseen, not because he hid, but because they could not imagine a Morty thinking the thoughts he carried. He used their assumptions as armor. He used their blindness as opportunity. The structure that oppressed him became the structure that protected his plans. This irony strengthened his decision further. Any system that underestimates those beneath it invites its own downfall. His decision was not fueled by hope that the multiverse would become perfect. He did not believe in perfection. He did not believe in utopia. He believed only in possibility. The Citadel eliminated possibility. Removing it would restore the natural unpredictability of existence. And unpredictability, while terrifying, is also fertile. It allows meaning to grow in ways systems cannot predict or prevent. The moment he committed fully to challenging the Citadel, something inside him shifted. His mind sharpened into purpose. His identity solidified. His thinking crystallized into clarity. He stepped into a version of himself he had spent years crafting. He became the architect of his own destiny. He made the decision quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses. The multiverse continued spinning unaware. The Citadel continued functioning unaware. Ricks continued believing in their superiority, unaware. Mortys continued fearing a system, unaware. Evil Morty alone held the truth. He would challenge the Citadel. He would break the cycle. He would reshape the meaning of being a Morty. And he would do it with the calm precision of someone who no longer feared the consequences of seeing the universe as it truly is. If power reveals itself loudly, control reveals itself quietly. The Citadel believed its power was absolute because its structure was visible, towering, and reinforced by countless Ricks. But Evil Morty understood something the Citadel never recognized, something that would become the backbone of his entire plan. Loud systems depend on people noticing them. Quiet minds dismantle loud systems from within. The greatest threat to an empire is not an army. It is a thought that no one sees coming. When Evil Morty decided to challenge the Citadel, he did not begin with action. He began with silence. Silence was his disguise. Silence was his shield. Silence allowed him to move undetected through a world that assumed it had already defined him. Ricks expected Mortis to be noisy with fear. Mortis expected Ricks to be noisy with authority. No one expected a Morty to be silent with purpose. That made him invisible. Not physically, but structurally. Invisibility created opportunity. The first step in his strategy was to avoid detection while learning everything he needed. Knowledge is the currency of control. The Citadel traded knowledge unevenly. Ricks hoarded it. Mortis were denied it. Evil Morty took it. Quietly, methodically, without drawing attention. He mapped political factions. He studied the administrative systems that kept the Citadel running. He observed how authority flowed, who held it, who pretended to hold it, and who believed they had none. He learned how decisions were approved, how they were enforced, and how failures were disguised. Knowledge revealed weaknesses. Not dramatic weaknesses, but structural ones. Weaknesses that came from arrogance, from routine, from habit. Every system that survives for too long becomes predictable. The Citadel was no different. It relied on assumptions about Mortis that had been unchallenged for generations. Evil Morty recognized those assumptions as the foundation of his strategy. If the Citadel believed Mortis were incapable of rebellion, then rebellion could be built within that blind spot. But knowledge alone does not create revolution. Revolution requires influence. Influence does not come from charisma in a place like the Citadel. It comes from pressure points, from understanding how people behave when they feel ignored. Evil Morty knew that many Mortys resented their place, but resentment is not organization. He needed to cultivate dissatisfaction without exposing himself. He listened to conversations in corridors. He watched arguments flare and fade. He studied which Mortys had already begun questioning their role, even quietly, even reluctantly. These Mortys were seeds. Seeds only sprout when given the right soil. Evil Morty did not rally them. He did not lead them. He did not tell them what to think. He simply made himself available to the right conversations. A whispered suggestion here. A small correction of a misconception there. A question asked with genuine curiosity rather than fear. Mortis began noticing him, not loudly, not publicly, but enough to recognize that one of their own thought differently. This recognition was a tool, not because he needed followers, but because followers were evidence that the system had cracks. If Mortis could be awakened from their conditioned fear, then the Citadel was not invincible. He tested conversations carefully. He never pushed. He never recruited. He observed how ideas spread naturally, how doubt moved through a population without force. The more doubt he saw, the more he understood the true fragility of the Citadel. People who doubt do not remain still. His silence also protected him from detection by Ricks. Ricks could read arrogance a mile away. They could smell defiance. They could sense challenge. Evil Morty presented none of that. He moved with the posture of a Morty who had accepted his role. His eyes did not flash with emotion. His voice did not betray ambition. His steps did not carry tension. He aligned every outward behavior with what a Rick expected to see. The perfect camouflage. Camouflage gave him access. Access allowed him to infiltrate. He learned which departments controlled information, which ones lacked oversight, which ones were understaffed, which ones relied heavily on Morty labor, because Ricks refused to do monotonous tasks. These gaps in responsibility became entrances to the structure's core. The Citadel trusted Mortys with low-level tasks because it believed they had no capacity for sabotage. Evil Morty used that trust to slip deeper into systems none of them monitored closely. He traced how data moved between sectors. He learned which Ricks inspected logs and which ones skimmed them. He found the digital skeleton of the Citadel's infrastructure and studied it like a surgeon studying anatomy. Every technological structure has a pulse. The Citadel's pulse was predictable, rhythmic, mechanical. Once he understood its pulse, he could disrupt it without detection. But that disruption would come later. First, he needed to infiltrate its political system. He understood something essential. Dismantling a system requires more than force. It requires legitimacy. Not moral legitimacy, but structural legitimacy. Systems crumble fastest when they are betrayed from the inside by someone who appears to belong. Evil Morty needed a position of influence. Not the highest position. Not yet. But a place where his decisions would be accepted without suspicion. He began altering his public behavior slowly, edging closer to roles that Mortis were not expected to fill. He volunteered for tasks that required reliability. He completed assignments with quiet precision. he displayed competence without pride. Rix noticed him, not as a threat, but as an anomaly. A Morty who did not complain. A Morty who did not panic. A Morty who performed well, without seeking praise. Rix mistrust obvious ambition from other Rix, but they misinterpret ambition in Mortys as obedience. Evil Morty weaponized that misinterpretation. This competence earned him placement in more sensitive areas. Areas where information flowed freely. Areas where authority intersected. Areas where decisions were drafted before being made official. He filtered himself carefully through these channels until he stood in the middle of decisions that would later shape the Citadel's fate. But infiltration alone was not enough. He needed a mechanism to take power at the right moment. Not through rebellion, not through violence, through election. Through a system the Citadel believed was controlled by Rix. He saw the political landscape for what it was: unregulated, performative, and deeply insecure. Rix created elections to mimic democracy, but they believed no Morty could ever persuade the population. Evil Morty recognized this belief as an opening. He studied political patterns. He studied voting cycles. He studied how candidates presented themselves, how campaigns were run, how Rix selected leaders. What he found was a system obsessed with appearances. Rix cared more about symbolism than substance. They wanted leaders who fit their mythology: confident, brilliant, emotionally detached, slightly chaotic. Evil Morty knew he could never fit this image, so he reframed it. He presented himself as someone who understood Mortys, who understood stability, who understood the flaws in the Citadel, but respected its necessity. Rix wanted stability more than freedom. Mortis wanted hope more than rebellion. Evil Morty offered both, while intending neither. His neutrality disarmed both sides. Rix saw him as a novelty. Mortis saw him as a possibility. His silence became charisma. His calm became authority. His lack of emotional display became competence. But even then, he did not draw attention. He waited, he watched, he listened. He inserted small ideas into discussions, small critiques disguised as curiosity. He let dissatisfaction grow, organically. He let Rix blame each other for failures. He let Mortis question small aspects of the system. Each small fracture grew into a larger one. His silence allowed everyone else to tear pieces off the structure without realizing they were being nudged into doing so. The brilliance of his strategy was simple. He never appeared to lead the revolt. He appeared to be the answer to the revolt others had already started. The Citadel believed he was a product of its dysfunction, not the architect of its unraveling. When the time came, when he stepped forward as a candidate, the Citadel was already halfway broken. Not by force, by doubt, by contradiction, by his silent manipulation. Votes moved toward him not out of zeal, but out of exhaustion. Rix wanted a change that would preserve them. Mortis wanted a change that would free them. Evil Morty promised both by promising neither. His language was calm. His presence was steady. His promises were vague enough to be interpreted differently by different minds. This ambiguity was not deception, it was philosophy. He understood that people desire meaning they can impose their own expectations onto. He allowed them that comfort, even as he prepared to dismantle the structure that fed those expectations. His strategy succeeded because he understood a truth the Citadel had forgotten. Revolutions begin with silence. Not when someone shouts, but when someone listens. Not when someone pushes, but when someone observes. Not when someone demands power, but when someone waits for power to be offered. By the time Evil Morty took the stage as a leader, he had already won. His victory was not in the votes he received, but in the blindness of the Citadel. It never saw him coming. It never recognized his mind. It never imagined that silence could contain strategy. It mistook obedience for insignificance. And that mistake sealed its fate. Power changes most people. It overwhelms them, blinds them, accelerates their worst instincts. But Evil Morty did not see power the way others did. To him, power was not an identity. It was not validation. It was not reward. It was a tool, nothing more. A means to dismantle the structure, not an end to cling to. When he finally stepped into a position of influence within the Citadel, the moment was not emotional. It was not triumphant. It was quiet. It felt like the natural continuation of a thought he had started long before other Mortys even knew they could think. The Citadel celebrated him cautiously at first, then confidently, then blindly. Ricks congratulated themselves for their tolerance. Mortis whispered hope into his name. Everyone projected meaning onto the moment. He observed their reactions with the same calm he carried everywhere. Their expectations did not impress him. Their excitement did not sway him. He understood that power was valuable only when used precisely, and precision requires distance, emotional distance, philosophical distance, strategic distance. The moment he gained authority, he felt the structure around him shift, not because he changed, but because the Citadel changed its gaze. When people believe you have power, they collapse their own autonomy. They wait for instruction. They anticipate direction. They surrender agency in subtle ways. Evil Morty understood that dynamic immediately. He did not want worship. He wanted clarity. Authority offered him a vantage point he had never possessed. From this position, he could see the Citadel's architecture not as holograms and hallways, but as lines of influence and dependence. He saw how Ricks consoled themselves with the illusion that they remained in control. He saw how Mortys tied their identity to the hope that one of their own could reshape their future. He saw how entire factions calibrated their movements around his presence, believing he would protect their interests. Power had wrapped itself around him instantly, but he did not let it settle. He kept himself detached, watching how people behaved when they believed they were glimpsing the future. The Citadel believed it chose him. That illusion made his next steps possible. His strategy never changed after gaining authority. He simply expanded it. Silence remained his shield. Precision remained his weapon. Patience remained his discipline. But power offered him a new tool: visibility. For the first time, his actions carried symbolic weight. His decisions reached individuals he had never met. His influence grew beyond conversation and into structure. Every choice he made shifted something in the system, so he chose carefully. He began with small decisions no one questioned, adjustments that seemed harmless: a new committee, a redistribution of labour, a reassignment of sectors, the removal of a few unproductive programs. These small moves had a cumulative effect. They increased his control over essential systems without drawing suspicion. He changed policies in ways that looked bureaucratic but were strategically precise. He replaced influential Ricks with those who lacked ambition. He empowered Mortys in areas where they would not be noticed by those above them. These decisions did not shake the Citadel. They weakened its spine. Power gave him access to deeper layers of the system, places where data flowed unchecked, where reports passed without scrutiny, where control protocols were stored. He learned more than he had anticipated. He discovered redundancies. He discovered vulnerabilities. He discovered the logic behind the Citadel's fail-safes. and he discovered that the Citadel believed its leader would always remain loyal. Systems that assume loyalty do not defend themselves effectively. He studied these weaknesses with the same intensity he studied philosophy. He mapped them mentally, tracing how a single interruption could destabilize multiple sectors. He calculated which moves would cause disruption without suspicion. Power became a lens that sharpened every detail. As he moved deeper into the system, something changed in the way others viewed him. Ricks grew suspicious. The kind of suspicion born not from evidence, but from instinct. They sensed that something in him did not align with their expectations. Their arrogance had delayed this recognition, but power magnified it. People grow uneasy when someone they once dismissed becomes unpredictable. Evil Morty accepted their discomfort calmly. Suspicion was not a threat. It was a sign he was nearing the point of no return. Mortis, meanwhile, projected hope onto him with almost painful intensity. Hope can be dangerous. It blinds people to truth. It makes them idealize others. It makes them ignore contradictions. Evil Morty respected their hope, but he did not share it. His mission was not to become a savior. It was to remove the structure that forced them to seek saviors in the first place. Power allowed him to observe a truth he had always suspected. Hopes and fears do not guide systems. Assumptions do. Ricks assumed he would not rise above his station. Mortis assumed he would protect them. Both assumptions became tools in his hands. He did not use them cruelly, he used them efficiently. The deeper he moved into control, the more his detachment became necessary. Power tempts even the most disciplined minds. It creates illusions. The illusion of invincibility. The illusion of righteousness. The illusion of destiny. Evil Morty recognized these illusions immediately, and he rejected them before they could form. He reminded himself that power was temporary. He reminded himself that leadership was camouflage. He reminded himself that the system around him was still hostile, even if it bowed politely. He practiced restraint. He avoided dramatic decisions. He avoided confrontational statements. He avoided drawing attention. He understood that power becomes most dangerous when it becomes visible. He preferred power that remained unseen, power that moved quietly, power that rearranged the world while people slept. With each decision, he guided the Citadel closer to instability. He did not break anything yet. He loosened screws. He softened walls. He weakened locks. He left lines unguarded. He created tiny errors in systems that once operated flawlessly. These errors grew unnoticed, like fractures beneath a polished surface. The Citadel still appeared strong, but foundations were shifting. During this period, he learned something about himself. He learned that the act of reshaping a system from within requires a particular kind of patience. Not passive patience, active patience. The patience of someone who knows the end of the system is inevitable, and the task is simply to ensure the collapse happens at the right moment. He gathered allies quietly, not loyalists, people who shared dissatisfaction, people who recognized truths about the Citadel even if they did not fully understand the depth of those truths. He did not demand obedience, he did not promise reward, he framed decisions as logical improvements. He helped others believe they were thinking for themselves. Influence is strongest when people believe they reached your conclusion without being led. As his influence grew, he began preparing the final phase. The phase where power stopped being camouflage and became a catalyst. He needed one decisive moment, one precise strike, one structural interruption that would cause everything else to unravel. Power gave him access. Strategy gave him timing. Philosophy gave him clarity, but courage gave him certainty. Power did not corrupt him, it clarified him. It revealed how far the Citadel had fallen. It revealed how desperate people were for leadership that was not rooted in ego. It revealed how fragile the system had become. Power allowed him to see that the Citadel's downfall would not be a tragedy. It would be a release. The exact moment power became a tool, not a title, happened when he recognized something simple. The Citadel had already lost control long before he stepped into leadership. It had been cracking for years. He did not need to destroy it. He needed only to tap the exact point where tension met weakness. Power made that point visible. And the moment he saw it, he knew that everything he had planned, everything he had studied, everything he had become, had led him to one truth. The Citadel was already ending. He would simply be the one who allowed it to fall. Every system has a collapse engine, even if it does not know it. A point where pressure exceeds structure, where assumptions outweigh stability, where fragility masquerades as strength. Most systems never recognize their collapse engine until it is too late. The Citadel was no exception. It believed itself eternal because it was large, because it was complex, because it had survived long enough for people to mistake longevity for permanence. But Evil Morty saw through that illusion long before anyone else. He understood that collapse does not come from the outside. It comes from within, from the contradictions a system refuses to confront. The collapse of the Citadel did not begin with an explosion, a speech, or a declaration. It began with a quiet truth lodged in Evil Morty's mind, a truth that grew sharper each time he studied the Citadel's structure. The Citadel was not stable, it was exhausted. It had reached a point where it could no longer sustain the weight of its own contradictions. Ricks believed they were in control, but in truth they were trapped by their own creation. Mortis believed they were powerless, but in truth their compliance was the only thing holding the structure together. Evil Morty recognized these contradictions as the engine of collapse. All he needed to do was activate it. He began by identifying the Citadel's 3 primary points of failure. Not technological vulnerabilities, but conceptual ones. The first was identity. The Citadel depended on Mortis believing they were inferior. But that belief was weakening. Mortis was starting to compare themselves. They were starting to question assignments. They were starting to observe inconsistencies. Evil Morty had helped cultivate this questioning carefully, subtly, without drawing attention. Once a population questions its identity, the system that relies on that identity begins to fracture. The second point of failure was unity. The Citadel claimed to be united, but it was riddled with factions. Scientific elites argued with political elites. Bureaucrats clashed with rebels. Ricks from different realities mistrusted each other. Mortys from different sectors resented each other. Every faction believed itself superior. Every faction believed the others weakened the Citadel. Evil Morty saw that unity was an illusion held together only by fear of collapse. It was a structure balancing on its own denial. The third point of failure was purpose. The Citadel pretended to exist for stability, but stability had become stagnation. Ricks were not evolving. Mortys were not progressing. Systems were not improving. Society had become a loop with no forward direction. A system without direction will eventually implode because people cannot tolerate purposeless repetition forever. Evil Morty understood this better than anyone. Nihilism can liberate, but only when embraced consciously. When meaninglessness is imposed, it crushes. He recognized that by targeting these, 3 points simultaneously, he could create a cascade failure. Not a single event, but a chain reaction. A collapse engine that would tear through the Citadel faster than any external attack. He did not need a rebellion. He did not need an army. He needed precise disruption, applied to the exact spots where the Citadel held itself together. The first disruption was philosophical. He introduced contradictions into political conversations. He framed questions that required introspection Ricks were not prepared for. He created doubt in the minds of those who believed they understood the Citadel's purpose. He did not attack, he destabilized. He planted philosophical viruses disguised as simple observations. Why do Ricks yield to a collective when they value individuality? Why do Mortis remain obedient when they outnumber Ricks? Why does the Citadel continue functioning when it no longer reflects its original goals? These questions were small, but they did not fade. They circulated. They multiplied. Philosophical disruption is the most dangerous kind because it cannot be destroyed with force. The second disruption was structural. Evil Morty reallocated resources in ways that seemed efficient but subtly damaged the infrastructure. He moved power grids slightly out of balance. He reassigned essential personnel to non-essential sectors. He updated protocols in ways that created hidden dependencies. He altered emergency response networks so they would fail under stress without failing under routine. No one questioned these changes because they appeared bureaucratic. But to him, they were threads. Threads he would pull later when the timing was perfect. The third disruption was psychological. He shifted how Mortys perceived themselves, not through speeches, not through propaganda, but through the simple act of giving them tasks Ricks believed they could not handle. When Mortys succeeded, they gained confidence. When they gained confidence, they became less predictable. When they became less predictable, the Citadel's stability weakened. Ricks noticed this unpredictability and responded with irritation. Irritation created tension. Tension widened cracks. Cracks became fractures. The fourth disruption was political. Evil Morty cultivated conflict between factions without appearing involved. He ensured that each group believed another group was gaining influence unfairly. He encouraged jealousy among elites. He encouraged distrust among leaders. He encouraged competition among Ricks who already struggled with ego. He understood that internal conflict is more destructive than external threat. Systems collapse fastest when people inside them turn against each other. The fifth disruption was symbolic. Symbols hold systems together. The Citadel's greatest symbol was the idea that Ricks were invincible. Evil Morty targeted this symbol subtly. He exposed minor failures. He revealed small vulnerabilities. He allowed rumors to spread about. Decisions Ricks mishandled. He created situations where Mortys solved problems before Ricks could. Each of these moments chipped away at the mythology that sustained the structure. When myths collapse, systems follow. The sixth disruption was emotional. The Citadel depended on emotional suppression. Ricks pretended they felt nothing. Mortis pretended they felt everything. Evil Morty destabilized both sides. He allowed Mortys to witness Ricks in moments of insecurity. He allowed Ricks to witness Mortys acting with unexpected confidence. Emotional contradictions unsettle people. They shake assumptions. Once assumptions weaken, control loosens. The seventh disruption was the final one, the activation point. He waited until the Citadel reached maximum tension, until identity was questioned, until unity was fractured, until purpose was hollow, until structure was weakened, until factions were restless, until myths were collapsing. until uncertainty permeated every level. Only then, when the structure was stretched thin across its own contradictions, did he introduce the final catalyst. It was simple, too simple for the Citadel to anticipate. He redirected a data flow, just one, a small alteration to a system no one paid attention to. But that data flow carried signals that synchronized several essential processes. When it fractured, everything else misaligned. Emergency protocols failed. Security systems misread inputs. Political channels lost communication. Power grids overloaded. The Citadel's failsafes activated incorrectly. The structure panicked internally before anyone outside understood what was happening. The collapse engine had activated, and once activated, collapse is uncontrollable. Ricks turned on each other. Mortis fled in fear. Sectors fell out of sync. Leaders argued instead of responding. Systems overloaded. Alarms spiraled. Entire departments shut down. It was not chaos by accident. It was chaos by design. Evil Morty watched it unfold with calm precision. Not because he enjoyed destruction, but because destruction was the necessary step toward freeing everyone trapped inside a system designed to repeat suffering. In the middle of the collapse, he moved with focus. He followed the plan he had crafted long before. He extracted what he needed. He sealed off what needed to be sealed. He protected those who could not protect themselves. And he positioned himself exactly where the structure would fail most dramatically, right at its heart. Not for theatrics, for closure. The Citadel did not recognize him as its destroyer until it was too late. It believed the collapse was accidental, random, a failure of systems. It never imagined a Morty capable of orchestrating the event. That lack of imagination was its downfall. In the final moment before the Citadel crumbled, Evil Morty felt no triumph, no joy, no victory, just completion. The collapse engine had functioned exactly as he knew it would. The structure was ending, the cycle was broken. The system that declared itself eternal had been undone by its own blindness. And now, for the first time, the multiverse would have to confront itself without the Citadel's shadow. When the Citadel finally fell, the multiverse expected spectacle. A grand declaration, a triumphant monologue, a dramatic display of dominance by the Morty who had outsmarted an empire built by geniuses. But Evil Morty never cared for spectacle. When the alarms screamed and the structure groaned, when corridors collapsed and lights flickered, he did not pause to savor the moment. He did not turn it into a victory. He did not look back at the system that had defined so much of his life. He simply walked forward. He moved through the ruins with the same calm he carried into every decision. Not because he was detached from the consequences, but because detachment was necessary to complete what he started. The Citadel collapsing behind him was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of transition, a shift from one state of existence to another. He understood that once a system dies, everything living inside it must adapt. His role was not to direct that adaptation. His role was simply to make it possible. The corridors around him twisted and buckled. Panels sparked. The metallic walls that once projected the illusion of order now showed their fragility. Systems that had functioned for decades failed within minutes. Drones malfunctioned. Security programs rebooted endlessly. Communications channels collapsed into static. What once felt monolithic now looked temporary, almost delicate, as if the Citadel had always been waiting for someone to expose its weakness. Evil Morty walked with measured steps, not rushing, not hesitating. He knew the structure better than anyone still inside it. He had studied its collapse pathways long before the first alarm sounded. He understood which zones would fail first, and which would hold just long enough. His exit path was not escape, it was choreography. As he walked, he passed Mortis, who stared at him with a mixture of fear and awe. Some recognized him, some did not. Some cried out, asking for help. Others froze, unsure of how to process what was unfolding. He did not ignore them out of cruelty. He simply understood that saving them was not his mission. The collapse was necessary. Intervention would only trap them in the same cycles he had spent his life breaking. He offered them something more valuable than rescue. He offered them possibility. Possibility does not feel like hope when the world is collapsing. It feels like terror. Mortis had never experienced existence outside the Citadel's structure. They had never imagined a life without classifications, assignments, evaluations. Their fear was not irrational, it was conditioned. The Citadel taught them that freedom was chaos. Now, in the middle of real chaos, they were being forced to confront the truth. Chaos was not the enemy, stagnation was. Rix reacted differently. Some shouted orders, no one followed. Some tried to repair failing systems. Some argued about whose fault this was. Their arrogance dissolved instantly in the face of their own, creation turning against them. The collapse did not just shatter their walls, it shattered their mythology. For the first time, Rix saw the limits of their intelligence. Not because their minds had failed, but because their assumptions had. Evil Morty did not take pleasure in their panic. He understood that they were experiencing the same thing Mortys had endured for generations. The collapse of certainty, the collapse of identity, the collapse of their place in a world built to favour them. He allowed them to face that collapse without interference. Growth cannot occur through comfort. Truth cannot arrive through stability. The deeper he moved into the failing structure, the more the Citadel revealed its secrets. Hidden chambers lost power. Backup systems misfired. Files that had been encrypted for decades opened themselves during shutdown sequences, projecting fragments of data across walls like broken memories. He saw glimpses of experiments long abandoned, factions that had risen and died without acknowledgement. Rix, who had been punished for thinking differently. Mortis, who had tried to resist and been erased without consequence. The Citadel's history spilled out like a confession. It was not a monument to genius. It was a graveyard of potential. Evil Morty did not stop to examine these ghosts. He had already studied them long before the collapse. He had carried their weight quietly, without sentimentality, without dramatics. Knowing their stories had shaped his resolve, but carrying them further would not serve his purpose. They were reminders of why the Citadel could not be allowed to survive. At one point, the path ahead collapsed into a plume of dust and flickering sparks. The floor plate tore open, revealing the machinery beneath. The Citadel trembled like a dying organism. Evil Morty paused briefly, assessing the instability, then chose an alternate route he had mapped in advance. These adjustments did not unsettle him. They simply confirmed how deeply the collapse engine had penetrated the structure. He passed through the central hall just as its massive hologram displays stuttered and died. Images of Rix in heroic poses fragmented into static distortions. The Citadel's emblem flickered, tried to stabilize, then dissolved into scattered pixels. Symbols are the last thing a system loses. When symbols go dark, collapse is complete. Mortys in the hall recognized him. Some whispered his name. Some stared in disbelief. A few reached toward him as if he could anchor them. But he did not approach. He did not stop. His presence was not meant to comfort. It was meant to clarify. Seeing him walk with calm through the chaos, made something inside them shift. They understood, even if only faintly, that the collapse was not an accident, that someone had finally done what they thought impossible, that a Morty had stepped outside the story entirely. Some Ricks shouted warnings as he passed, trying to assert authority, trying to regain control. Their voices echoed in the failing chamber, with all the weight of habit and none of the weight of power. Authority collapses faster than buildings when it is built on fear. Evil Morty did not acknowledge them. He had no need to. Their authority had already crumbled. They simply had not felt it yet. When he reached the evacuation bay, he found it in disarray. Shuttles malfunctioned. Automated systems misfired. Artificial gravity shifted unpredictably. Groups of Ricks argued at the consoles, trying to override safety locks that were no longer functional. Mortys clustered near wall panels, unsure which alarms to trust. He walked past them all. Some tried to stop him. They wanted answers. They wanted reassurance. They wanted meaning. They wanted someone to tell them why this was happening. But Evil Morty knew that meaning must be built, not handed out. He would not give them answers they had not earned. Freedom requires discomfort. Discomfort requires honesty. He would not lie to them by pretending the Citadel deserved mourning. He would not soothe them by pretending the world had lost something irreplaceable. What they were feeling was not loss, it was withdrawal. The Citadel had been their certainty. Now that certainty was gone. He boarded the vessel he had prepared long before the collapse began. A sleek, efficient construct. One built not for conquest, but for departure. Leaving the Citadel mattered more than destroying it. The Citadel had trapped entire identities. Remaining near it would allow those identities to reform. Leaving it symbolized something far more important. He was stepping into a version of existence no Morty had ever entered. He did not look back as the door sealed. He did not need to. The noise behind him, the alarms, the shouting, the collapsing metal spoke for itself. The Citadel had been undone by its own contradictions. He had simply allowed it to reach the moment it had been heading toward since the day it was built. The shuttle lifted from the bay. Through the small viewport, he saw nothing of the chaos. Only darkness. Only stars. Only the quiet expanse of a multiverse that had never expected a Morty to walk into it freely. He felt no guilt, no relief, no satisfaction. Only continuity. This moment was not an ending. It was a transition between forms of existence. A movement from structure into possibility. A movement from identity into choice. A movement from expectation into autonomy. He knew the multiverse would interpret his departure in many ways. As abandonment, as rebellion, as cruelty, as liberation, as manipulation, as heroism. None of these interpretations mattered. Interpretation belongs to those who remain inside a system. He had stepped beyond it. Walking through the ruins without looking back was not a rejection of the past. It was an acknowledgement that the past could no longer shape him. A life defined by the Citadel had ended. A life defined by autonomy had begun. He walked through the ruins because he needed to. He did not look back because he chose to. And he left because freedom, once understood, cannot exist inside any structure built to contain it. When Evil Morty left the Citadel behind, he did not step into triumph. He stepped into uncertainty. The multiverse stretched around him in every direction. An impossible expanse of contradictions, paradoxes, infinities, and quiet pockets of nothing. Most beings would find that terrifying. Most seek comfort in the idea that the universe has shape, intention, or narrative. But Evil Morty understood something deeper. The absence of meaning is not a void to fear. It is a landscape, a place where meaning can be built, rebuilt, destroyed, and rebuilt again. Freedom does not require purpose. Freedom requires possibility. He sat alone in the cockpit of his ship, the hum of the engine, a soft vibration under his feet. No Citadel, no Rick, no Morty assignments, no predetermined role waiting to swallow him. The silence was absolute, not the oppressive silence of the Citadel's hallways, where fear hid behind every quiet moment, not the reactive silence of Mortis too afraid to speak. This silence was expansive. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with the entire horizon open. He breathed slowly, not because he was calming himself, but because calm had become his natural state. The collapse behind him was already fading from his mind. He did not re-examine his choices. He did not rehearse what happened. He did not seek justification. He lived by a philosophy that did not require validation from past events. What mattered was the space ahead. Most people think freedom comes from removing a cage, but Evil Morty understood that removing a cage creates a different challenge. Once the structure is gone, once the expectations vanish, once the external meaning dissolves, there is a moment of profound disorientation. People are uncomfortable with self-direction because self-direction reveals how much of their life was shaped by obedience. He felt that disorientation briefly, like a faint pressure in the chest. Not fear, recognition. The recognition that he was solely responsible for himself now. His life would be what he shaped it to be, nothing more and nothing less. For someone who had built meaning with intention for years, this recognition did not frighten him. It clarified him. He turned off the ship's interfaces one by one, watching the lights dim slowly. He preferred the dark. It reminded him that vision begins before illumination. When everything goes dark, the mind creates its own outline of reality. He leaned back in his chair and let the silence settle. Freedom, he realized, is not an action. It is a condition. It is the absence of imposed narrative. It is the moment when your thoughts no longer orbit someone else's gravity. Freedom is not about escape. It is about becoming unrecognizable to the system that once defined you. But freedom is also difficult, not because it is lonely, but because it requires responsibility. Responsibility not to society, not to a cause, but to one's own mind, to one's own direction, to one's own truth. Evil Morty understood this better than anyone. His nihilism had given him the tools. The collapse had given him the space. Now, his future required a new kind of thinking. A thinking rooted not in what must be destroyed, but in what could be created. He opened his eyes and looked at the starfield ahead of him. Each point of light represented a possibility, a universe where anything could happen, a timeline where anything could grow. Some universes would be hostile, some would be peaceful, some would be chaotic, some would be predictable. None of them held meaning by default. Meaning was not found in the stars. Meaning would come from the choices he made while moving among them. He thought about the people he left behind. Not with guilt. With clarity, he understood that the collapse would reshape their lives in ways he could not predict. Some Mortys would find new roles that did not require obedience. Some Ricks would create new structures, some worse than the Citadel, some better. Some would learn, some would deny, some would rebuild the past, some would reject it. He did not control their futures. That was the point. A free world is not one where people behave predictably. A free world is one where unpredictability becomes natural. He did not see himself as their savior. He did not see himself as their villain. His relationship to them had ended the moment the Citadel fell. He had given them possibility. What they did with that possibility was their responsibility, not his. Most people cling to the idea that a leader must guide those who follow. Evil Morty did not believe in followers. He believed in individuals. He believed that the multiverse must breathe on its own. He leaned forward, typing a series of commands into the ship's console. Navigational systems blinked to life, mapping nearby dimensions. He could go anywhere now. He could become anyone. He could remain exactly who he was. Freedom does not require reinvention. It requires honesty. He did not need to change to justify his freedom. He only needed to choose. He thought about his philosophy, the one he had built slowly over years of observation, reflection, and dismantling. Nihilism had been his foundation. Autonomy had been his direction. Strategy had been his method. But what now? What emerges after the structure is gone? He realized that his philosophy did not end with destruction. It continued into creation. Meaninglessness was not a conclusion, it was a starting point. He could create new principles, new ideas, new interpretations of existence. He could explore universes where identity worked differently. He could examine societies not shaped by hierarchy. He could observe worlds functioning without clear rules. He could experiment. He could evolve. Freedom did not end with leaving the Citadel. It began there. He considered what he might seek next. Not purpose, not belonging, not validation. He sought understanding. Understanding is a form of meaning that does not pretend to be permanent. Understanding grows, shifts, adapts. He wanted to understand what existence meant outside the structure that had shaped him for so long. He wanted to know what a Morty could become when the universe no longer demanded obedience. He wondered what loneliness would feel like now. Loneliness inside the Citadel was suffocating. It came from having thoughts no one was allowed to share, from seeing truths others refused to acknowledge. But loneliness in freedom is different. It is not the absence of people. It is the presence of self. He felt that presence now, not as isolation, as clarity. He stretched his hand toward the viewport, watching the faint glow of distant stars brush the outline of his fingers. Each star represented a possibility. Each possibility was a threat to stagnation, a reminder that the universe did not end with hierarchy. The universe did not end with collapse. The universe did not end with understanding. The universe continued, indifferent to all of it. Indifference is terrifying only when you expect the world to care. Evil Morty never expected the world to care. That is why he could face indifference without fear. He imagined stepping into a new world and observing it silently, watching its people, learning its systems, studying how meaning emerges naturally from interaction, not from authority. He imagined adapting his philosophy to something new, something beyond destruction, something that would not restrict him, something that would not burden him, something that would grow with him. Freedom, he realized, was not a destination. It was a practice, a way of thinking, a way of moving through the universe without being claimed by it, a way of accepting that life is shapeless and shaping it anyway. He leaned back again, resting his hands in his lap. He let the hum of the ship settle into a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. He felt the quiet, the clean, open quiet that follows the destruction of an idea that once seemed eternal, the quiet that happens before something new begins. He understood something profound in that moment. When nothing has meaning, freedom becomes the only meaning you truly need. Not because freedom fills the void, but because freedom allows you to explore it without fear. When the universe stops telling you who you are, you can finally decide. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to listen, to feel the weight of possibility, to accept that he had broken something enormous, to accept that he had freed himself completely, to accept that every step he took going forward would be chosen, not inherited. When he opened his eyes, the multiverse waited. He did not know where he would go next. He did not need to. He had no destination, no plan, no expectations, just the certainty that he could shape meaning from nothing whenever he wished. This was not chaos. This was clarity. He smiled faintly, not because he was happy, because he was free. And in a universe where nothing has meaning, freedom might be the most honest form of meaning anyone can build.